Chapter 54 looks at community ecology. This is going to wrap up our last chapter for Bio 7. A biological community, let's get our highlighter going here. Okay, one more click. And a biological community is an assemblage of populations of various species that live close enough for potential interaction. So a community, in essence, can be defined as looking at a particular area, and within that particular area, looking at the populations of different species that live and interact within that area. The first concept is looking at interactions that can occur within the community and whether or not these interactions can help or harm the species that are involved in these interactions. So we give these interactions special names, and these names are called interspecific interactions. So the specific part is referring to the species. The inter is referring to between the species. We're going to look at competition, predation, herbivory, different types of symbiosis, so parasitism versus mutualism, commensalism, and another one that's called facilitation. So as we look at these interspecific interactions, we're going to look at each species and we're going to define whether or not the interaction is positive, negative, or no effect, and we're going to give a no effect a 0, a positive a plus, and a negative interaction a minus. Interspecific competition, so looking at competition, this is going to be a negative interaction. So this is going to have a detrimental effect on both species that are part of the competition. Now, this is going to happen very typically when a resource that both species share are in short supply. This leads us to a concept that's called competitive exclusion. And competitive exclusion is a very important concept to know, so you'll probably see this on the exam. Competitive exclusion is stating that if you've got two species in a particular area, and those two species compete for the same resources, then more than likely one of the species is going to be eliminated and the other species will remain to be able to use that resource. There's a principle that's called the competitive exclusion principle that states that two species competing for the same limiting resources in the same area cannot coexist. Okay, so two species competing for the same limiting resources cannot coexist in the same place. One of them is going to win. So this is a principle that has been shown to occur in a multitude of times. So that leads us to some more definitions here. One of those is an ecological niche. Okay, so we define the ecological niche as the total of a species use of both biotic and abiotic resources. So you're looking at what that organism might eat and where that organism might live in terms of water supply and housing supply as well. An ecological niche can be thought of as that organism's ecological role, what that organism does within its particular localized environment. So it goes on to say here in our third bullet that ecologically similar species can coexist in a community if there's one or more significant differences within their niches. Resource partitioning can help with having niches that are different, and this can enable similar species to coexist in a community. So it's a way of sharing the resources that are present, and each of the species would have a very slight difference in what they may feed upon, for example. Here we're looking at two different lizards. Okay, so we've got this particular lizard that likes to perch on fence posts and other sunny areas, and this particular lizard that likes to hang out on shady branches. So all of these are slightly different species of the same genus here. So different requirements, slightly different requirements for nutrition. They're all found in different places. Remember, we talked about vertical stratification of forest. So here's our vertical stratification up and down. We've got the canopy up here at the top, and then we go to the low tree understory, and then we go down here to the shrub understory, and then down here to the ground. So you can see different niches are being occupied by different organisms. So they live together in the same place, but they're able to share the resources that are available. So that would be our resource partitioning. Predation is a plus-minus interaction. So this means that one species, the predator, is going to kill and eat the other, which is the prey. So good for the predator, they get dinner. Bad for the prey because they don't. Think of it that way. Along with predation, we're going to see some adaptations that have come along for both predator and prey. So here we've got some feeding adaptations of predators that help to make them a better predator. These can be things such as claws, teeth, fangs, stingers, even the presence of chemical poisons that help to immobilize the prey to make them easier to catch. But the prey, on the other hand, are going to display defensive adaptations. So these can include behavioral defenses, and the behavioral defenses can include hiding, fleeing, running away, forming large populations, so to speak, as in herds or schools, self-defense. Okay, so fighting back. We might see alarm calls in certain organisms as well. Okay, so all of this would be tied into behavior. Animals also have morphological and physiological defense adaptations. So you might see cryptic colorations or camouflage that might make our animal very difficult to see. Okay, so make sure you know all the behavioral defenses and cryptic coloration. Okay, here we have a canyon tree frog, and let me point out to you our frog here in the middle, who is very well camouflaged against the granite rock that he's sitting on. So same color, same pattern. So this is our cryptic coloration. Animals that have a nice, effective chemical defense often have a very bright coloring that go along with them. Now, this coloration is meant to be a warning to other animals, and we call it aposematic coloration. So it's a warning to predators that say, I don't really taste good, so don't come mess with me, and if you do mess with me, you'll probably die. So predators have learned to be very cautious with dealing with prey that have very bright aposematic coloration. They want to live, right? Here is a poison dart frog. So in nature, this red coloration that you see here, and even the black and white, is going to stand out, especially when you look at the sky against these nice bright green leaves. But in some cases, Other species of organisms have used this bright coloration to their advantage. So a prey species may gain significant protection by mimicking the appearance of another species. So this mimicking, there's two different types that we'll look at. The first one is called Batesian mimicry. And in Batesian mimicry, we're going to see a palatable or harmless species that's going to mimic an unpalatable or harmful model. So in real terms, what that means is you're going to have a species that tastes just fine that's going to mimic another species that gives off a chemical that either tastes really bad or can be poisonous to the predator. Here's Batesian mimicry, and we've got a harmless species that mimics a harmful one. So if you look at these two guys, they look very similar in appearance, especially with the coloration that you have here and the coloration over here, very similar in structure. So to another animal, especially one that may not see in color, this could look very similar. Mullerian mimicry is the second type. In Mullerian mimicry, you have two or more unpalatable species that resemble each other. So in this particular case, you've got a cuckoo bee and a yellow jacket that have very similar patterns, okay, the black and yellow patterns, and very similar shape as well. So both of these are very unpalatable and very harmful to predators. So they have learned when they see this black and yellow coloration to stay away from them. So in this case, you're looking in terms of numbers. So by having multiple species have the same coloration, then all of the members of those species are going to be left alone. Herbivory is a positive-negative interaction. So this is when you have an herbivore or an animal that is going to eat parts of a plant or even parts of algae. So herbivory is necessary for certain animals that eat plants on a daily basis. Okay, so it has led to, however, evolution of plant mechanical and chemical defenses and also adaptations by the herbivores to get around these defenses. We don't have a nice listing of these, so let me go through some of these. The plant mechanical and chemical defenses. Some plant mechanical defenses would be things such as spines, nettles that are harmful to the animal. Chemical defenses would be chemicals that taste bad. For example, here in Southern California, we have the sage plant. Sage plants taste good to us. In fact, we use sage as a spice to cook with, but to animals, the sage that we like is very strong to them, and they do not taste good, okay? So animals tend to avoid those very strong tasting chemicals. Symbiosis is defined as a relationship where two or more species live in direct and intimate contact with one another. So that's a symbiosis. There's different types of symbiosis. Parasitism is one, and this is a plus-minus interaction. So you have one organism that we call a parasite that is going to get nourishment from another organism, and we're going to call that other organism a host. The host is going to be harmed in the process of the parasite living on the host. Two different ways to look at parasites. Endoparasites are going to live within the host body. Ectoparasites are going to live on the outside of the host body. Parasites typically have a very complex life cycle, and this complex life cycle can contain a number of hosts. Some of these parasites will change the behavior of the host in a way that it can increase the parasite's fitness. Okay, so the parasite is drawing its nourishment from the host itself, and as the fitness of the parasite increases, as more eggs are being made, as more eggs are being shed to the outside of the host body, the host itself can be declining because of the resources that are being taken by the parasite. Mutualistic symbiosis or mutualism is a plus-plus interaction. So this is a type of interspecific interaction, a symbiosis that is going to benefit both species. So mutualism can be obligate, where one species cannot survive without the other. It's an obligation that they live together. Or it can be facultative, and facultative is where both species can survive on their own. So we had the terms obligate and facultative back when we talked about aerobic and anaerobic. Commensalism is a +0 interaction. So in commensalism, one species benefits and the other is neither harmed nor helped. Commensal interactions are very hard to document in nature because once you're in a very close association that comes with mutualism, it's going to more than likely affect both species in some ways, and a lot of times we just can't see what the benefits may be to both sides. Okay, so this is an example of commensalism. The birds and the oxen go hand in hand, and it's not quite sure as to what the benefit is to both of these. Facilitation can be either a positive-positive interaction or a 0 or positive interaction. So facilitation is when one species has positive effects on another species without having direct and intimate contact. So the example that they give here for facilitation is that black rush is a plant species that can make the soil more hospitable for other plant species that come along after the black rush has been there. That's facilitation. Makes it easier for other species to come along. Okay, moving on to our next concept. Diversity and trophic structure characterizes biological communities. So you have to keep in mind, in almost any interaction, you're going to have a few species that are going to have very strong control on structure. So we're going to see a few species in a community exert strong control on that community structure. Two fundamental features of community structure are going to be species diversity and feeding relationships. Species diversity is defined as the variety of organisms that make up the community. The variety of organisms that make up a community. We're going to see two components: species richness and relative abundance. So species richness, you're looking at how many different species live within a community. Relative abundance is the proportion that each species represents of all individuals within the community. Okay, looking at community 1 versus community 2. Community 1, you're looking at 4 species, A, B, C, and D, and you're looking at the exact same percentages of those organisms with that, within that community. So you've got, and let's back up here, remember our species richness and our relative abundance. Okay, so the species richness is the 4 species. The relative abundance is equal within these species. Okay, looking at community 2, again, we have 4 different species, but looking at the relative abundance of each species, species A is found as 80% of the total community population. Species B and C make up 5% each, and species D makes up 10% of that population. You're looking at the same number of species, but when you look at relative abundance of each species, then you can see the makeup of each of these 2 communities is quite different. Communities that have higher diversity are going to be more productive and more stable in their productivity. They're going to be able to withstand and recover from any sort of environmental stress, and they're going to be more resistant to invasive species. And invasive species are organisms that have become established outside of their native range. They've invaded a particular area, if you will. That's our invasive species. Trophic structure is looking at the feeding relationships between organisms in a community. In fact, in terms of community dynamics, it's going to be a very key factor. We're going to see something called food chains that link together the trophic levels from producers at the bottom all the way up to the top carnivores at the very top. Okay, so here we've got a terrestrial food chain and a marine food chain. So we've got primary producers at the bottom. Primary consumers are going to eat the producers. Secondary consumers are going to eat the primary consumers. Tertiary consumers will eat the secondary and the primary consumers. And the quaternary consumers are going to be kings of the food chain, and quaternary consumers can consume all of the consumers. Okay, so they're not going to necessarily have predators that hunt them, so they'll be the top of the food chain. A food web is a little bit different. A food web, you're still looking at interactions, but you're looking more at a branching food chain. And this branching food chain can show very complex trophic interactions. And here's an example of one. So down here, we still have our primary producers and consumers. And here with our blue lines that we're seeing, shows you that humans are at the top. Whales are considered to be our quaternary consumers. Everybody kind of feeds on everybody else. Okay, so fishes, squids, birds, all in the middle will eat, but they'll also be eaten as well. Okay, so these food webs can become very complex. This one's looking at an aquatic food web. Species can have a very large impact on a community as well. So these species tend to be highly abundant, or they can play a very pivotal role within community dynamics. Dominant species falls into this category. So a dominant species are those that are most abundant or those that have the highest biomass. So these dominant species have very powerful control over what happens to the rest of the species within a community. So powerful control over the occurrence and even the distribution of other species within that community. So the example that's given here is that sugar maples have a major impact on shading and also on the soil nutrients that are available in the eastern part of North America. So this can have an effect on the distribution of other plant species that are found in a community where you have a lot of sugar maples. And typically, if you find one sugar maple, you're going to find a whole lot of them. They're typically very abundant within the community. Keystone species also exert strong control on the community, but it's done by their ecological role or their niche. So in contrast to dominant species, they're not necessarily the most abundant within the community. Okay, so the keystone species is going to have a very profound effect. One of the examples is on sea stars, and how sea stars are definitely a keystone species in the intertidal communities. So sea stars can actually keep down the population of certain other organisms within that intertidal community. Ecosystem engineers, these are called foundation species, if you will, can cause physical changes in the environment that can affect community structure as well. Now, foundation species are not always found within a community, but when they are found, they can cause damage and they can exert a lot of control over other species found within that community. So the example that they give here is that beaver dams can transform landscapes on a very large scale. So the organisms that are found downstream from those beaver dams are going to have a profound change when the dam stops the flow of water coming or makes the flow of water go a slightly different direction. So it can be a very big effect on the organisms that are downstream. Here's our beaver, and here we can see the beaver dam that this beaver has made. So busy little guys, huh? Busy as a beaver. Disturbance can influence species diversity and composition. So disturbances can be natural occurrences or they can be unnatural occurrences. So decades ago, many ecologists favored the view that all communities are in a state of equilibrium. Sometimes they go towards the left, sometimes they're going to go towards the right, but they're always kind of equilibrating back and forth within a set parameter. Clements was an ecologist who suggested that species in a climax community can function as a superorganism. Tansley and Gleason challenged whether or not these communities were at equilibrium. So jumping back real quick, the superorganism that we're talking about, the whole group of species is going to act as that superorganism. Okay, so everything is in that state of equilibrium and is going to stay in that state of equilibrium. So nothing's going to change, if you will. Tansley and Gleason came up with some differences here. So recent evidence of a change has led to non-equilibrium model. So this describes communities, instead of being at equilibrium, as being constantly changing, especially after having some sort of disturbance come through that community. So a disturbance is defined here as an event that changes a community, that removes organisms from a community, or that might alter resource availability. So fire would be considered a disturbance within a community. So taking the fire as a significant disturbance, it's found that a high level of disturbance is the result of a high intensity and high frequency of disturbance. They ended up coming up with what is called the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. Moderate levels of disturbance can give us greater diversity than either high or low levels of disturbance. Very high levels of disturbance might exclude slow-growing species that are found within that community. Low levels of disturbance may allow dominant species to exclude less competitive species. So you might see a certain species come out on top if it was a little bit more dominant, if the disturbance wasn't high enough. A large-scale fire happened in Yellowstone National Park in 1988, and this demonstrated that communities can often respond very rapidly to a massive disturbance. So the Yellowstone forest is an example of a non-equilibrium community. This is what Yellowstone looked at right after the fire, and 1 year after the fire, looking at this area, it looks nothing like what this looks like. Okay, so your book goes through, there's been very well documented series of steps that occur after a fire in order to repopulate the area that has been disturbed. Yellowstone is now considered to be non-equilibrium because in essence with this mass scale disturbance, almost all of the life was wiped out. Okay, so and it really had to start from scratch again. It's coming back quite nicely. So the ecological succession that I talked about, there's going to be a very predictable sequence of changes that are going to occur after a disturbance. These sequences have been very well documented. So a primary succession is going to occur where no soil exists when succession begins. So we've got ecological succession, we've got primary succession, and secondary succession is in an area where the soil remains after a disturbance. Okay, so very rarely do we go back to that primary succession and start really from scratch. Okay, human disturbance is huge. So humans definitely have the greatest impact on biological communities worldwide. Human disturbance to communities are going to reduce species diversity as a whole. Okay, so kind of keep that in mind. Here we've got a coral reef. Thanks to humans, we've gone from this to this in a fairly short amount of time. So species diversity has dropped tremendously in this area. Okay, so going back through and looking at, okay, so not our beaver, but Clements, you should know Clements. And Clements believed in communities being in a state of equilibrium. And you should know Tansley and Gleason. And both of them challenged whether or not communities were at equilibrium, because you have organisms coming into and going out of our communities. So it seems that a non-equilibrium model with disturbances happening on a periodic basis is much more plausible, communities being at equilibrium. Okay, so that's the take-home message between those two. Pathogens can also alter community structure both locally and globally. So ecological communities are going to be affected by these pathogens, which are defined as disease-causing microorganisms, viruses, viroids, and prions. You're going to learn about all of these in Bio 6, but the important thing here is disease-causing. So pathogens can come in and alter community structure very quickly and very extensively. Pathogens can have dramatic effects on communities, such as the coral reef communities are being decimated by something that's called white band disease, and that white band disease is killing the coral reefs, so the coral reefs are then not being able to support the diversity of species, and we saw that a couple of slides before. Human activities are transporting these pathogens around the world at unprecedented rates. If you go back in time, travel around the world used to be very difficult, okay, and a very time-consuming process. With the advent of the jet, that has changed things tremendously, and the lowering of prices for airline tickets has also changed the way that humans travel. Community ecology is still going to be needed to help study and combat these pathogens that are around the world. Zoonotic pathogens, so zoonotic pathogens, can be transferred from other animals to humans. The transfer of these pathogens can be direct, or it can be through something called a vector. Many of today's emerging human diseases are considered to be zoonotic. Identifying the community of hosts and vectors for a pathogen can help prevent disease. So an example that they give here, recent studies identified 2 species of shrew as the primary host of the pathogen for Lyme disease. So it was thought that Lyme disease came from deer ticks, and we get the disease from the deer ticks when they bite into our skin and they inject the pathogen into our bloodstream. So the shrew, which is a very small mouse type organism, could be the primary host, and then the ticks would get it from the shrew. There's our little shrew, little bitty guy. Okay, so here's some testing that's going on our shrew. Avian flu, very highly contagious virus of birds, hence the avian part. Avian flu has spread from Asia to North America through migrating birds. And here we have an ecologist that is testing a bird to see if it does have avian flu. Pretty nice job, huh? To go hiking all the time and to capture animals, test them, then release them back to the wild. So let me back up here real quick. It's important to look at these pathogens and to look at the animals that are host to these pathogens and to look at the patterns of how the pathogens can spread throughout the world. If we have this knowledge, then we can effectively deal with preventing the spread of these pathogens. So that's very important. So our very last slide here is showing the interspecific interactions that we talked about. So competition, predation, herbivory, the different types of symbiosis to include parasitism, mutualism, commensalism, and then our last one that we looked at, which was facilitation. So we see if it's a positive, a negative, or neither type of interaction, and a very quick description of what each one of these are. So this might be a nice figure for you to pay attention to at the end of your chapter. Okay, so this sums up our chapter 54. I'm going to end our discussion on community ecology. I hope you've enjoyed it.